Well, good morning, or rather I should say good evening, because you'll be watching this in the evening, but I'm actually at the church at 11 o'clock in the mornings, but that's life. Now, tonight I thought we would talk about a parable. I know that some of the other speakers during the evening service here have talked about parables, but we did parables in my Sunday school class several years ago. And the first thing I did was I asked someone to define a parable. Well, somebody said it's a story. I said, good, yes, what else? And they said, well, it's a story told by Jesus. I said, you're getting better, you're getting warm now. And then finally somebody said it's a story told by Jesus with a message. And I think that was what, that would be what we would all say we think a parable is. A Greek word parabole, that's where we get our word parable from. It means comparison, like literally casting aside, setting something alongside something else. It's a story or a short saying that seeks to drive home a point the speaker wishes to emphasize. And he illustrates it with a familiar situation drawn from ordinary life. And if you think about Jesus' parables, he uses ordinary circumstances to get his point across. The problem that we have with parables, and the problem that they had with parables in Jesus' time, was that the meaning was not immediately clear in all the cases. The hearer will have to analyze it, to ponder on it, to sleep on it, and hopefully at some point he will have that aha moment when it becomes clear. Now, we can think of parables as a literary device in which a comparison is made between God's expectations and what we actually do in our lives. In other words, the parable is designed to challenge our view of conventional wisdom. Well, somebody asked, how many parables are there? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some people count as many as 60. Most scholars will tell you there are 3 or 4 dozen. That's a round number. I have personally settled on the number 50, so we'll leave it at that. Now, if you look at slide 1, we're going to look at some of the methods that Jesus used in his teaching. Jesus was a wisdom teacher. Wisdom teachers were common in that day and age. They were not always religious wisdom teachers. But Jesus used certain tools to get his points across. Parables were one of his main methods of teaching his message to the people that were listening. He'll also use aphorisms. These are short, terse formulations of a truth or principle. These make great one-liners. If the blind lead the blind, they both fall in the ditch. Leave the dead to bury the dead. You've all heard those. Those are aphorisms. And then he used other methods, a little more subtle. A parable may begin like a once upon a time story. He used similitudes, counterparts, an imaginative comparison, is like, or as if. Yeah, I'll get it right in a minute. The most shocking thing that Jesus used, to us moderns anyway, was his use of his hyperbole, outrageous exaggerations. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your hand offends you, chop it off. Those are hyperboles. They're not to be taken literally. We don't do things like that. But you get the message. Now, this first parable is going to deal with a revelation of God. It's going to give us one of the attributes of God. This is predominantly a theological parable, with God being the central reference point. And we'll see some vivid examples of human conduct, how humans behave, and what God would desire. Now, we're going to look at the parable of the unmerciful servant, which is found in Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 to 35. the setting. Jesus is in Capernaum with his disciples. Let me say a word about the Gospel of Matthew right now. Matthew is divided into 6 narratives and 5 discourses. The narratives tell about Jesus and his activities, while the discourses are his actual words. This particular parable, and if we can have slide 1, this particular parable is prefaced by Peter's question about forgiveness. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times, or 77 times, depending on your translation. The rabbis at the time, the Jewish thinking at the time was that a repeated sin could be forgiven 3 times. If the same sin was committed against you the 4th time, it could not be forgiven. So Peter, he's thinking, I'm big-hearted Peter here. I'm going to be a little generous. I'll go 7 times. How about that, Lord? And he probably was fishing for a pat on the back. Now we have to backtrack a little bit when we think about this conventional wisdom of forgiveness. Back in Genesis chapter 4, 23 and 24, there was a guy named Lamech. We don't need to go into the details, but Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to me, wives of Lamech. Hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech is avenged 70 times 7 times. Jesus transforms this vengeance of Lamech, where Lamech was thought he was avenging a wrong against him 70 times 7 times. Jesus reverses this into a principle of forgiveness. It's a reversal of the eye for eye and tooth for tooth mentality that was prevalent back then. What's Jesus doing? He's taking the world, the conventional wisdom of that ancient world, and he's turning it upside down. And he seems to be saying, look, a sin should be forgiven an infinite number of times. He then explains this principle with a parable. Now, a parable, like most good stories, are divided into 3 parts, beginning, the middle, and the end. We all know that. There are 3 main parts to this parable, plus an application. The first part, 23 to 27, concerns a king who's dealing with his servant who owes him a great deal of money. The second part, 28 to 31, relates the actions of the servant regarding a debt owed him. And the third part, 32 to 34, deals with the king and the servant in light of what the king learns in the interim. The application, 1835, expresses God's view of an unforgiving nature. Now let's look at slide 3, the king and his servant. And Jesus said, therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all of his possessions had to be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. Jesus begins this parable with the word therefore. Whenever you see the word therefore, it usually alerts us that this is going to be a message from or about God. And then he says the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, in the Greek, aorist passive tense, that doesn't really need to be sticking in your mind. But what it means in this particular grammatical tense, the kingdom is already present. The kingdom has already dawned with the coming of Jesus and has become like the parable that follows. All who wish to be included in this kingdom are expected to heed the message of this parable. Now, you say, well, what in the world is 10,000 talents? Let me alert you, it's a use of hyperbole here. 1 talent was equal to 6,000 denarii. Denarii. A denarii was 1 day's pay for a common worker. If one worked 300 days a year, a talent was equivalent to what? 20 years' pay. 300 days, you have to factor in they didn't work on the Sabbath, they didn't work on the religious holiday, so 300 is a good round number to use here. So if you do the math, 10,000 talents is equal to what? 200,000 years' pay. It's unlikely that a king, I don't care who he was or anyone else, would have loaned this kind of money. I don't think there was that much money in Palestine at that time. It's hyperbole for emphasis. Well, like most of us who get in debt and get a little short, the servant begs for more time to pay. And he asks the king to forgive the debt. Well, he doesn't ask the king to forgive the debt. The king hears his plea and he forgives the debt. Of interest, if you look things up, 10,000 was the biggest number they used in the ancient world. Anything more than that was a heap, a bunch, or a lot, or whatever. What's the message here? God is willing to forgive the worst or the greatest number of sins imaginable. King, he uses this word king. King is often used as a metaphor for God in these parables. Now, the second point, we jump to the servant and his fellow servant, verses 28 to 31. Now, look at slide 4, please. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him again to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay you back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. Now, what's happened here? The forgiven servant is unwilling to forgive a fellow servant who owes him money. Now, 100 denarii is quite modest in comparison to 10,000 talents, isn't it? The king forgave an enormous sin or debt, as you want to call it. Do the math yourself. This is not even comparable. We can never forgive on the scale of God's forgiveness, can we? Are we even expected to? Now, that's an interesting question for you to think about. So what happens? The poor fellow is put in jail for non-payment. Interestingly enough, Jewish laws forbid putting another Jew in jail for a debt. You could farm out your wife or your daughter or your son as a slave or yourself to work off the debt. The length of service depended on the amount of the debt. Roman law was different. If a Jew owed a Roman money, he could be put in debtor's prison. If a Roman owed another Roman money, he could be put in debtor's prison. So there was a little bit of disconnect with the two legal systems in Palestine at that time. Now, let's look at slide 5, verses 32 to 34. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I cancel that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servants, just as I had on you? In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owes. Rather harsh, isn't it? The king states the thesis of this parable. I forgave, therefore so should you. Note the king's anger. God will not look kindly on those who do not forgive. Let's look at slide 6 now. This application, this actually the moral and the message of this this parable in verse 18:35. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. From your heart, what does that mean? When you forgive someone, you must really mean it. I remember once in our class, Sunday school class, several years ago, a very astute comment was made about holding a grudge and forgiveness, and I'll mention her name and embarrass her to tears. It was Tammy Golden. She said, holding a grudge and refusing to forgive is like drinking poison and hoping it kills the other person. So think about that. The deeper meaning here, to live well, to live with Jesus means to live with a generous and forgiving heart. Jesus has given us this parable of a revelation of God's compassion and mercy, a basic attribute of God here. He exhorts us to live a better life with compassion and mercy for others, and concludes with a warning. God forgives those who forgive, otherwise puts the hammer down. Now, if you look at slide 7, I'll leave you with some questions to meditate on. If you have any questions, this is the first time I've ever taught anything without having people asking me questions, but any questions you can just email me at that email address. I don't mind. Why is it so difficult for us to forgive when we have been transgressed against? Somebody sins against you, does a mean trick to you. It's hard to forgive them, isn't it? You would much rather pop them in the jaw. But think about it. Why is it so difficult for us to forgive? And what does true forgiveness mean to you? Is it done from the heart and forgotten, or do you forgive on a conditional basis? I'll forgive you if you do less than such. That's not really forgiving, is it? Can you forgive someone who continues to sin against you repeatedly and ask for forgiveness? For example, a gossiper spreads rumors about you time and again and always asks for forgiveness when caught. Now that's a little hidden message there. Anybody that gossips is going to get caught. They don't realize it, but they're going to get caught. Well, if they keep doing it and you forgive them, how many times should you forgive them? 70 times 7? Think about it. What about someone who transgresses against you and does not ask for forgiveness? They don't care if you forgive them. Can you forgive someone who doesn't ask for it? Or some people beyond forgiving? Think about it. Verse 18:35, if you look at it and with the preceding verse in mind, it suggests a vengeful and harsh God. What is your reaction to this? A lot of people say they don't like the Old Testament because God seems to be going around ordering David and Saul and whoever to kill people, men, women, and children, whatever. Is God vengeful and harsh? I'll leave you with that. Think about it. Thank you very much.